I'm here in Georgetown, the very place where the MV Barima began what was meant to be a routine voyage to Port Kaituma in the Northwest District. On Saturday, July 18, the vessel departed from this city carrying approximately 179 people, including 17 crew members. Tragically, that journey ended in the worst maritime disaster in Guyana's recent history when the ferry sank off the Essequibo coast. The tragedy has left families mourning unimaginable loss, survivors grappling with painful memories, and communities across the country searching for answers while coming to terms with profound grief. Beyond the rescue efforts and the investigations, there's another reality that deserves our attention: the emotional and psychological impact on everyone affected, from those who lost loved ones and those who survived, to the search and rescue teams and a nation united in sorrow. Tonight on Sources, we examine the human side of this deadly incident. Joining me is grief and trauma specialist Marva Langevine, who will help us understand the intersection of grief and trauma, what people may be experiencing in the aftermath of such a devastating effect, the signs to look out for, and how individuals, families, and communities can begin the journey towards healing. I'm Svetlana Marshall, and this is Sources. Welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight, we come to you approximately 1 week after MV Barima sank offshore Guyana, just off the Essequibo coast. On board, there were 179 people. To date, more than 65 bodies have been recovered, and there were about 76 survivors. The search and rescue operation continues along the Essequibo coast in the Atlantic Ocean. Tonight, we decided that we'll focus on grief and trauma because we know as a nation we're dealing with a lot. And to do so with me, I have grief and trauma specialist Marva Langevine. Marva, thank you so much for speaking with me this evening, and welcome to Sources.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Just to give us insight to your background before we get into the program, just tell me a little about yourself, the work that you do.
I was a teacher for over a decade, and currently I'm the mental health counselor for a mining company. My passion is grief and trauma, I have a charity, Guyana Golden Lives organization, which focuses on the needs of grieving children and those who support them. So we provide grief counseling and other forms of support. I'm currently also the lecturer for a postgrad course on grief and trauma resilience at the University of Guyana, which was created to build the capacity of helping professionals in Guyana to respond to communities and families that are experiencing grief and trauma so that they can have the necessary resources to cope, recover, and heal.
Now, Guyana is experiencing one of the darkest periods in its history. Beyond the numbers and the headlines, we're seeing immense human suffering, 65 plus life lost, and the numbers are likely to increase with recoveries every day. And the survivors, we must also speak of them. From grief and trauma perspective, what is happening emotionally across the country? I know you probably would have spoken to many people already.
Yeah. So this is a national tragedy. This is a crisis. And what we're seeing is acute trauma being experienced by the survivor and those who are directly linked to the deceased. And we are seeing secondary trauma, which the nation is experiencing because we are witnessing this. So that entirety is traumatic loss because we have a loss and the loss circumstances is relating to a trauma. And when that happens, it produces grief and it produces trauma responses. So the entire nation, the communities, the families, they're experiencing traumatic loss. And with that, it produces not only grief responses, traditional grief responses, but trauma responses. And we really need to pay attention to that because as it relates to trauma, that is something that we need to recover from because it's an injury. It's an injury to our body, it's an injury to our psyche, and it places us in a place of heightened emotions, which further impacts our daily functioning. So that is something we need to pay attention to and know what we need to do in order to, over time, lessen the impact of the trauma.
Okay, I want you to break it down a little more. Deal with grief by itself. You know, sometimes people pass away, you lose someone, you grieve that person, and then explain the difference of trauma and dealing with the grief as a result of the trauma.
That is an excellent question. So grief is universal and it's highly personal. It's a normal reaction to a loss of a loved one, an important attachment figure, and also it can be the loss of something that we valued. Now, trauma, as I said, according to the Social Work Dictionary, is defined as an injury to the psyche or the body as a result of a shock, a violence, or an unanticipated event. So in simple terms, trauma is our emotional and psychological response to an event that we perceive to be a threat to our lives or the lives or to someone else. So when that happens, so with trauma, as I said, it's an injury. So it requires very specific responses so that we can get back to that place of normal functioning. It disrupts our well-being. It disrupts our emotions. It disrupts our behaviors. With grief, as I said, it's a normal reaction. It does disrupt our emotions because there are common grief responses such as crying, memory issues, unexplained physical symptoms. But with trauma, that layer, it produces flashbacks, hypervigilance, and what is happening in the brain as well, the alarm system, the amygdala, is overactive. So it impedes on how we regulate our emotions. It affects our memory. It affects our ability to connect with others. So we will see common trauma responses, such as some people get into the flight mode. So there's flight, fight, freeze, and fawn. We might see people who withdraw. We might see people who become aggressive. Some who become even busy and try to avoid the memories relating to the traumatic event. Not everyone experiences a trauma after a traumatic event. So that is very important to understand as well. So it is also very personal. So trauma is the emotional and psychological reaction to the event. So why I said that, because an example of a traumatic event is witnessing a homicide. 5 of us could witness a homicide, but it doesn't mean that all 5 of us will be traumatized. So it's important for us to understand that trauma is something that is personal, and there are various factors also that contribute to the intensity and the duration of the trauma responses after, especially in that acute phase. So that is why necessary resources and interventions, and what I like to call protective factors, are necessary, and people need to be aware of it so that they can tap into it and reduce the risk of negative health outcomes, which is depression or PTSD, and substance abuse as a form of coping.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the trauma and grief responses that you spoke to, what are some of the likely, and I know you said it's personal in the case of trauma, what are some of the likely reactions or responses persons may have, especially having been on the boat, they have survived, but they have to go on? What are some of the responses they may experience?
Yeah, so there's a possibility of course, some of the survivors experiencing trauma. They are traumatized. And some of the common trauma responses, as I mentioned before, is that hypervigilance. The survivors are most likely experiencing flashbacks. Some might be experiencing guilt that, they would have survived. We don't know for the hours that they were out there in the water what they witnessed. So we have these intrusive memories that they might be having. And of course, very intense emotions. So extreme sadness. Some of them might be very angry, irritable. Some of them might be having some memory issues as well, because there's a part of the brain that I spoke about, the amygdala, that becomes overactive, but there are other parts of the brain that becomes underactive, and that's the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for our thoughts and our behaviors, and the hippocampus is responsible for memory. So after trauma, in the acute phases especially, those areas are underactive. So there's fragmented memories. Some of them might not even remember what is happening, and that can cause some frustration because they're seeing the news, they're hearing people talking about it, so some of them might not even be remembering it. And if they do remember, it is being processed in a way as they're still in the state, they're still in this threat, because the amygdala is overactive. The hippocampus does not have the ability to really contextualize as yet. They don't have that capacity right now. So when they have the memory, they go straight into, fear and anxiety as if they're still in the moment. So some of them might be reliving the moment, if they don't get the opportunity to ground, they might be reliving the moment. And with the reliving the moment of memories and the fear and anxiety responses, of course, that impacts their behavior, it impacts their sleep, it impacts their appetite. So it's a whole host of responses. And I have to say, these are common responses. I know everyone is deeply concerned, but there is also, as I said, protective factors and resilience factors, which is helping the survivors, the communities, and everybody that's closely associated with this tragedy.
Would some persons maybe experience difficulty sleeping, nightmares and things like that? And you spoke about survivor's guilt. Why that tend to happen? I mean, you survive, especially on the vessel, there are many people who are related. For example, a grandmother that I spoke with, she had 8 grandchildren on board, and so 4 of them survived, but 4 of them did not make it. And of course, these are children. And the little boy said to his mother, who's related to the grandmother, the mother's mother, he said, "You know what? I saw my sister, we all fell, and she was spinning, an engine fell on her. He tried to save her, but he couldn't." And we heard many, many stories like that, where there were attempts to save loved ones, but it just couldn't because of the circumstance. How do you deal with that?
It's going to be challenging and it requires processing. So we would have mentioned that this specific incident is a traumatic loss incident, and we see the intersection of grief and trauma. So they're experiencing grief symptoms and trauma symptoms, and that causes, some challenges in processing and recovery and healing. So as it relates to survivor's guilt, so you have the layers of family members trying to save others, but based on, the circumstance of how the boat went down and the water and all these things, it prevented them from doing what they wanted to do in the moment. So there's that helplessness there. So now that they're out of the situation, there's some form of safety. Now they're replaying and they're saying, I should have, I could have. And this is to address this, or to support those individuals, is to validate how they're feeling. And our brain tends to focus on the negative. All right. So they feel helpless. They're thinking back that they could have done differently. But it's to validate their emotions and to let them know that, you tried your best, or you did your best, and it shows that you really cared for this person. But unfortunately, here we are. And what is needed moving forward is that sense of safety, that stabilization, the opportunity for them to release those emotions, and sleep. Trauma impacts sleep, and that's why it's important to tap into whatever resources to help you sleep. So with the grounding and the various activities for the release of the emotions, it increases your chance of getting the sleep, because some of the processes that happen, cognitive processes that happen while we're asleep, helps us to process the traumatic memories while we're awake. So everything is interconnected. And that brings me to protective factors. So especially for the survivors, we have to look at what are the protective factors that are available, and how we can even introduce it into their lives. So one of it is the opportunity to release the emotions. That is through grounding, that is through movement, because the body is in a constant state of alert. They think that they are in a threat. So their emotions that are there's a dysregulation that is occurring. So activities to regulate their emotions, which is closely linked to safety. So what is safety? Safety is a state. And come back to the definition also from the social workers dictionary. Safety is defined as a state that is essential to trauma recovery. So what happens in that state is the unhealthy relationships, unhealthy coping mechanisms, negative emotions, or those intense emotions are reduced, and trust, a sense of safety, well-being, and positive coping is increased. So once there's that opportunity for regulation and the release of some of those pent-up emotions, and there is safety linked to connection, so having someone validating, witnessing your pain, someone to talk to, that fosters the release as well. That facilitates the release. And then also the sleep, as I mentioned before. Cognitive processes are disrupted after trauma especially, and even with grief. So there's the preoccupation, there is the deep yearning and the missing of this important attachment figure. And when there is the intersection with the trauma, which is that injury, then it's necessary for processing. So before we even get to cognitive processing, we need to process in a way where what has happened physiologically is managed, and there needs to be some form of release, and to let the body know, the nervous system know that I am safe. And then it creates a path for the processing of the memories, where the hippocampus now can contextualize the memory, and then the intervention in terms of the processing can occur, and that's where professional therapy comes in as well.
Because for me, it sounds all complex. And I'm thinking how would a child manage all of this? I know, well, for parents, you spoke about creating a safe environment, and so that that person could process. But in case of children, how do parents help them understand? How could they deal with a child who will survive the incident? And from a government perspective, what support government should be offering to survivors, adults and children?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question because grief is personal, but the way grief is experienced is different. Way it's experienced and the way it is exhibited is different in children versus adults. And why is that? Children are still growing. Their brains are still developing. That part I spoke about, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for reasoning and thinking and higher order thinking. It's different in a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old. That is why 5-year-olds can't solve an algebra problem, you know? So the brain is still developing, and that's why we need to pay attention to that. And we have to have appropriate intervention to match the target population. So in children, even for toddlers, middle childhood, adolescents, we see the grief reactions are different even in those age groups. So for the younger children, you might, of course, some of them might not have the words to express how they're feeling. And that's why we need to look at some of the behavioral symptoms. So the crying spells, the withdrawal, the avoidance. And then you will see that in the younger children. And then there is a time where you see them playing and everything seems normal because they don't have that capacity to really hold on to painful and intense emotions for a prolonged period of time. So when there's that time where you see that they're exhibiting some grief responses, that is where for the adult and the caregiver, the trusted person in the home, to model healthy coping mechanisms to ensure that they provide some form of safety, and very important, maintain a routine as much as possible. Usually in loss situations, when we're talking about the survivors, their routine are disrupted, especially if the individuals who would have unfortunately died was a part of that routine is disrupted. So try your best to maintain, if it has to be a new routine, something where they every day, this is something that they can do or they have to do, which is linked to movement, all right, which is linked to emotional regulation. With teenagers, we see the increased risk of substance use as a coping mechanism because the intensity is felt. No, they're at a stage now where they can really rationalize things. So they tend to replay a lot of things. So we can think about the teenage survivors. They might be replaying, and then of course that keeps them in a state of hypervigilance, etc. So look for the responses, and it's not to think that something is wrong with them. All of these reactions are normal based on the circumstance, you know, and is to provide the necessary resources for them. So whether it's connection, is if you're keeping them connected to their peers, if they're in a space where they want to talk, if you want to link them to a professional, just so that they can process and they can cope. And most importantly, regulate their nervous system once again. As it relates to adults, they're depending on the age as well, they come with years of lived experiences. So one thing that impacts the way we resolve and we recover and we heal after traumatic loss is our resilience level, our mental health status, our social support system. What does that look like? So for adults especially, is to stay connected to people that can hold space for you. If it's adults that have to take care of children, that is where the community comes in play. Because, of course, their functioning is decreased. I'm saying all these things for a normal person who is within their window of tolerance, where they can think clearly, where they can problem solve, where they can connect, that is fine. But a traumatized adult or even a grieving adult linked to this tragedy, their functioning is impaired. And this is where the community and the extended family, they have to come in and step in and provide whatever support, whether it's meals, whether it's ensuring that they eat, ensuring that they sleep, and also helping them with childcare and whatever that they need to do. And also extending grace, because these are people who have jobs. You know, they had their routine before and that is disrupted. So try your best to ensure that there's a routine for them. So there are things that they can do personally for themselves. And of course, there's need for connection. There's need for a community of care to really stand beside these families, these adults and these children, and provide the necessary support. Not everybody will want to talk, all right? And those who want to talk, allow them the opportunity and the space to talk, and just holding space. So some people might feel unequipped to support these families, but you don't have to be a professional to provide grief support, but you can provide the necessary tangible support and the needs that they might need. So whether it's shelter, and this is to government and other concerned parties. So ensuring that, they have shelter, and all this is related to safety, shelter, food, and whatever necessary resources that they need, just to have that stabilization. And then there will be the need for the actual processing. It's going to be a tough road ahead. And as I said, depending on the protective factors available, it's going to reduce the risk of negative health outcomes, or it can unfortunately increase the risk of negative health outcomes. And it's just to, their social workers and therapists that are on the ground, it's just to ensure that, they're doing their necessary screening and assessments. And with that, you can see who's high risk, who's low risk, and also tap into resilience factors. Human beings, we're highly resilient. And it brings me back to the point where, as bystanders, we're looking and we're like, oh my gosh, these people are so traumatized. It's going to be doom and gloom for the rest of their lives. No, there's strength after trauma. There's something called post-traumatic growth. And there's the opportunity where people can find meaning in some of the toughest experiences, and they move forward in a way where they can honor, especially when it's relating to a loss, they can honor the memory of who they would have lost and move forward in a way where they can find a sense of purpose again in life.
You spoke about negative and positive outcomes. You also referenced to maybe, like, for example, the teenagers turning to alcohol to cope. Would that be considered a negative outcome? Could you explain the two?
Yeah. So substance use as a coping mechanism is an increased risk after a traumatic loss. And why do people turn to substances? Because they're so overwhelmed. Their entire world has been shattered. And if they don't have the skills or the necessary resources to process that pain, they turn to drug and alcohol to numb the pain. So there is this numbing that they want. They might want to avoid, they don't want to remember, and that's why they turn to substances.
That's why we need the social workers on ground and the psychologists and so on ground. Okay. Now, the other thing is, earlier I mentioned that we've had about 67 survivors, 76 survivors, and they found more than 60 plus bodies. They recovered those bodies, but many more people are still missing. How does that complicate grief? Because when I went down there at Charity, there were people walking out with tears in their eyes because they're going through bodies after bodies, because there's an identification process. And so they're hoping that maybe this body might, because the time span for rescuing, it might be an act of God for somebody to be rescued at this point, because it's more than a week now. And so they're now in a state of recovery, and so the families have to go and look at these bodies, and then they maybe have to look at to decide whether this is the person. Yes, this is a ring that I'm familiar with, because they're so decomposed. Now that in itself is traumatizing, but the fact that they do so and then they come up empty-handed, does that complicate the situation?
Yes, definitely it does. Seeing the distressing images, seeing the bodies, and then depending on the length of time the bodies are being found, as you mentioned, it could be decomposed. And then there's this hope that this is my relative, this is my loved one, and I can finally get a chance to the next step, which is for burial. It complicates things. It increases the distress that these loved ones are experiencing. So this is where the community really needs to hold space. It's going to be extremely challenging. And then there is the fact that some bodies may not be discovered. within Guyana and the Caribbean context, a big part of our grief ritual is the funeral, is the burial, is actually seeing the body. And if we can think back to COVID, a lot of people, had complicated grief reactions simply because they weren't able to attend funerals. Or some families didn't even get to see the bodies, especially if it was a COVID case, the protocols that was put in place. So that increases the risk of course, negative mental health outcomes such as anxiety and depression. And it's just to ensure that they get the necessary support so that we can reduce the incident of them developing these psychiatric disorders. And if it does happen, there is treatment available as well. But of course, as I said, there are protective factors, the opportunity for regulation, the opportunity for connection, the opportunity to get sleep, and the opportunity for safety. It cannot reduce the distress that these families will most likely experience from seeing these bodies and then sometimes not even seeing the body. But okay, what is it that we're going to do? And there's treatment available, psychological professional treatment. And outside of that, I want everybody to know, communities to know, family members to know that they can also play a role in holding space and providing the necessary resources that are needed.
When it comes to both survivors and it comes to grieving families, you spoke about the responses being normal, right? When should a relative looking on or a family member looking on should become concerned that, hey, this is not normal, you need professional help?
That is a great question. So as it relates to trauma, to get a diagnosis for PTSD, you have to meet certain criteria. And this is done after 4 weeks. If after 4 weeks, the acute phase of the trauma is not resolved, or the trauma responses, the intensity doesn't lessen, then there is need for professional support. So what are you looking for? You're looking for intense avoidance of trauma memories or events. You're looking at consistent, persistent flashback, persistent sadness, low mood. All the emotional behavioral reactions is linked to their functioning. They're unable to bathe, they're unable to go to work, they're unable to move forward. I don't like to use the term move on. They're unable to move forward. If after 4 weeks you still see these signs, these trauma reactions, then it's time for professional support. There will be an evaluation, and of course in mass casualties, homicide, these are high-risk populations for developing PTSD, but it's not saying that they will develop, all right? So once you have the protective factors, it can reduce that risk. A very small percentage of the population will develop PTSD, but there's treatment available for that. As it relates to the grief and the healing and the processing of the grief. Now, this is debated, especially in the grief space and the research, but there are so many factors that contribute to how we heal and how we process grief after a loss. So we have specific populations such as spouses. If you lose a spouse and those who lose a child, they experience more intense grief reactions versus a sibling or losing a friend. So it's to keep an eye on this target population. And there's something called prolonged grief disorder. So this is a mental disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a mental disorder as well. Grief and trauma is not a mental disorder. So grief can become complicated or prolonged, where what you're looking for, the literature says after 6 months, if the person is still yearning for the deceased, still preoccupied with the memories and the circumstances surrounding the death, if they have lost all hope, if there's hopelessness, if their sense of meaning in life is gone. People debate this, widows debate this, because they say, this is a major loss in my life. So of course I'll be experiencing these things. But of course, there are very specific structured interventions to treat complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, which and what happens is it's very structured and it addresses the very specific grief related and trauma related responses to the loss. So where is that? Where's the yearning? Where's the preoccupation and of course the flashback? Because not all loss is traumatic, but all trauma has some layer of grief, and that's why there need to be a space for grief processing. And when, especially if it's a traumatic loss, there must be that space for trauma processing where the recovery happens.
Now, where do you go? You talk about structural assistance in a sense where it is you're seeking the help of a professional. Where in Guyana could persons source this? I mean, you're a professional as well.
Yeah, so outside of, as I said, prolonged grief, I'm going to start at just acute grief and the acute phase of trauma. I'm not saying you necessarily need a professional. I'm not saying you don't need a professional at acute phase.
It depends on the situation.
Yes, and your need. If you feel like you need to speak to a professional, of course, the professional helps you to process, and you also learn healthy coping mechanisms moving forward. So there's definitely the Ministry of Human Services, there are social workers there. So I have developed and I lecture a very unique postgrad course on grief and trauma resilience, which has built the capacity of our helping professionals. Most of them are social workers. So you can get from Human Services, the Family Enhancement section. They deal with families on a whole, and I really love the work that they do there. So if they're grief layers or traumatic loss layers, then they will make necessary referrals as well to the stakeholders that can respond. I know there's the mental health unit. They have their counselors and psychologists. I would have had social workers from the mental health unit that came to the course. They're private psychologists, and it's just to ensure that they're grief literate, they're trauma informed, because in school, you don't really learn about grief. So grief counseling is a very specialized area, just like those who were responsible for treating depression and psychiatric and other disorders. So when you're looking for someone, ensure that they're grief literate, they're trauma informed, and they have the necessary skills to support you through the journey. For me personally, I have a network. So I have a charity, as I said, Guyana Golden Lives organization. So you can reach out to us on our Facebook page. Our email address is guyanagoldenlives@gmail.com. guyanagoldenlives@gmail.com. And I have my resource persons. There's Dr. Myers. She's a grief recovery specialist from Barbados. There's Dr. Margaret Chatour. She's from Trinidad. And there is Dr. Will Campbell right here in Guyana. So all of these are PhD trained. And they provide guidance to me, and we also work together. So even through the charity, we have grief camps where we bring the children together, where they get the necessary emotional support, but they also meet other children who would have gone through what they've gone through, and then that creates a safe space for healing. Of course, there's the grief counseling, as I mentioned. There's trauma-informed approaches that we used. So those are some of the resources that are available.
Well,
Yes.
thank you so much for sharing. Now, when we talk about this incident, it's not just those who were on the vessels or those who knew people on the vessel. It's the entire country, communities affected, the entire country affected. Right now, we're going through a process of mourning. There are interfaith services being held and prayers going up for those who have survived, but also those who are grieving the loss of their loved one. What does collective grief, I mean, and I ask this question with respect to people who may not have known somebody on that vessel, but just looking on, just being a citizen of the country affected.
Yeah, so that's where the secondary trauma comes in. And we have witnessed and we continue to witness everything unfold. And with secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, what happens is sometimes we become traumatized in a way as if we were the direct individual. We were directly impacted by the event just by witnessing. So if we feel that our safety, our worldview has been shattered, then of course that's where the trauma is, and we have these emotional psychological responses. And I would have mentioned, so as a nation, we know that there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of anger, even with trauma and grief and the intersection. There's that layer of anger surrounding the circumstances of the death, and the anger could be for other reasons as well. And it's just to, anger is a secondary emotion. What is beneath that anger? What a lot of people are feeling is hurt. It's confusion, unanswered questions, and it's also to create a space for people to express that, not to suppress it. It's normal to be angry. It's normal to ask questions. But as you acknowledge and you validate that I'm angry, what is beneath it? Is it disappointment? Is it confusion? Is it shame? Is it extreme hurt? And of course, the questions surrounding. And then we have questions such as, could this have been avoided? Yeah. And with new information that is surfacing, that adds to the overwhelm. And some people might be feeling helpless as well, especially when the circumstance is perceived as something that could have been avoided. That adds a deeper layer to the complications of our emotions. And it's just to honor that, to validate it, and find a way to release it in, if it's through demonstrations, if it's through mobilization, if it's through creating a special fund or something to support the family. How are you directing those emotions? Because it's good that you're feeling this. It's normal. And especially if you have a very strong sense of justice. This is what you're feeling, this is what the nation is feeling, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it on social media. We're seeing it in the streets. We're all feeling it. And it's to continue to hold space for the families and to validate yourself. And secondary trauma is real. So sometimes you might be experiencing the flashbacks and hypervigilance. And because of our brain is so wired to think negative thoughts, and when the amygdala is overreactive, we have that loop. We have to come to a place where we can override that. And sometimes it takes us first saying, okay, this is what I feel, and just stopping that loop from happening. And we can engage in positive self-talk, not to dismiss what is happening, but it's just to optimize our brain health, because our nervous system, our immune system, everything is compromised right now, especially for those who are traumatized. So it's to optimize brain health, eat the food to nourish your brain, engage in resources to let your brain know that you're safe, so that the amygdala can get back to that place of normalcy where you don't feel like you're under threat. Nourish your body, eat the necessary foods, because there's a dysregulation happening physiologically as well. It can impact your heart functioning. So some people experience their heart race. Some people got issues and all these things. So it's to nourish your body, nourish your mind, and normalize your reactions. Don't rush it. Don't dismiss it, and pay attention. If you find like you're avoiding it, yes, there's a time we're telling people, take breaks. Do not consume all the images and the media all the time, because of course that is gonna tell your brain that you're under threat all the time. So take a pause, take a break, take a time to engage. But then even when you engage, what are your emotional regulation skills? What are you doing afterwards? All right. So moving forward is for us to, move forward with a sense of purpose. Not every question will be answered, and also is to even accept that. So there's a form of acceptance and a space where you can, release and regulate and ground.
I'm happy that you said that sometimes you just have to accept that not every question would be answered, because while you spoke about the healing process, I was telling somebody, as a journalist, we deal with these kind of events, and, when the Henry Boys and Harry Singh were killed in 2020, that was traumatic. And then while still coping with that, dealing with that, as somebody who would have interacted with the family, then we had the issue of Adriana Young, her mysterious death. And these are events that the nation was deeply involved in moved, hurt. So many questions. And now we're dealing with this mass casualty where dozens of lives lost. You know, is it that how do we move from here? You spoke about normalizing things, but how do we normalize in a sense when it seems to be recurring? You know, what could be done? I don't know.
Yeah. So of course, we can't prevent tragedies from happening, but we can create systems and communities where we maintain safety, where we ensure that the psychological and the mental well-being of our children, our citizens, are at a place where they can connect, where they can regulate, where they can problem solve and make good decisions. So as much as we can prevent everything from happening, we can make necessary changes and modifications to reduce the likelihood of these instances, these situations happening. So relating to the tragedy, there are valid questions and survivors' reports of very specific safety concerns. So moving forward, we can purpose in our heart to ensure that whatever space that we're in, health and safety is maintained. We can purpose in our heart if we're in a community where there is a loss or there is the likelihood of things escalating to violence or death, how can we intervene and provide the necessary support and help to the survivor or the victim or even the person perpetrating? And this is how intervention and social services was created. I'm very big on preventative measures. Of course, we can't, maybe let me backtrack. Yes, we can prevent. I want to say we can't stop certain things from happening, but there are preventative measures that we can put in place to ensure that I'm going broad now in Guyana, there is not another domestic homicide, there is not another road fatality, there is not another maritime tragedy. So there are very specific things that we can do, and we really need to look within ourselves, and we need to look around and observe and see what is going wrong, where it's going wrong, and what we need to do individually and collectively. And this is just another opportunity for us to come together and really demand the change and also be the change that we want to see. Because if we are part of the problem, it takes some self-awareness as well to see if we are part of a problem, if we are contributing to somebody, being traumatized, or somebody even before traumatized, becoming distressed. Is my action causing that? Is it something tangible that is causing that? And how can I be a part of the change? So with national tragedies, it makes us pause and put things into perspective. Even with grief, we tend to focus on things that we didn't focus before. There's increased, so as much as there's these negative outcomes or these common reactions in the acute phase, what happens also after is some what I like to call positive outcomes, where increased relationships, people tend to lean more on their families and their friends. They value them more. People find that they have this strength that they didn't know they have before. Adversity brings out, and it makes us see how strong we are. And as I said, yes, we are impacted by these events, but also there is the resilience factor within us. We adapt, we grow, we can move from strength to strength, not dismissing, not forgetting, but moving forward in a way we're honoring and saying, okay, let me play a role in preventing something like this happening again. And who are the key stakeholders responsible? And how can we work together, or how can we demand that there is not another tragedy like this happening?
The other set of people we don't often speak of, and in this case, it would be the rescuers, right? The men and women in uniform who are out there every day, part of the search, rescue, and recovery mission. I'm talking healthcare workers. I'm talking the fishermen who just heard of the incident and venture out to assist and have brought in, some of them, 25 bodies. what institutional support we could offer them, but what advice you would also, because sometimes process like as a journalist. Sometimes, we go to crime scene and then we're all busy trying to get the information. What is the person's name, the age, the address, what happened? And in the moment we don't process, but when everything settles, like, then I guess we begin to process what really transpired. There's likely impact. What institutional support could be offered, but also what advice you'll offer to first responders and people out there in the field actively involved in these operations.
Yeah. So you said something, when we settle on the processing. So when, the cameras are put away and everybody goes back to their respective corners, the first responders, they must be intentional about the processing. They must be intentional about the coping. And that's why in training for helping professionals, for journalists, for doctors, they learn something called self-care, because we are at risk of vicarious trauma. We're higher at risk for vicarious trauma because we are hearing the stories, and we're also seeing, depends on the field that you're in, you're seeing these dead bodies, you're seeing distressing images, and that has an impact on your psyche. That has an impact on your emotions. So it's just to be aware of what is happening. Sometimes, especially for first responders, they have specific things that they need to do. They're there to rescue. They're there to gather what they need to gather. And of course, their amygdala is overreactive, and there's a stress response, and they get this adrenaline rush, and they get the work done. But when the dust settles, what are you doing? What are you noticing? Are you taking the time to recover? Are you taking the time to heal? So doctors, those are one of the professions at the high of the chart who are at risk for self-harm. Because doctors, they're in the ER, they're seeing constant deaths. So the trauma response, some of them become numb. Some of them turn to substances. You might see doctors who smoke a lot, who drink a lot. That is a form of coping. Not saying all of them who drink and smoke is as a result linked to their work. But the research has shown that first responders, doctors, even journalists, they're at risk of vicarious trauma. And then even if you get vicarious trauma, what are your protective factors? What are you doing for self-care? What are you doing for recovery and processing? So if you have, community connection, if you ensure that you're sleeping, or you might have to even get help to sleep. I tell my clients to get melatonin. That's a natural pharmaceutical to help sleep. Sometimes some people may need prescribed sleeping pill just to ensure that your brain gets to rest. And also, don't be afraid to speak to a professional. Don't be ashamed to speak to a professional. As I said, when you come to the professional, structured intervention where there is the processing, specifically of the traumatic memories, and there is the ability for you to learn various coping mechanisms as you move forward, so that you can manage and you can get back to that place where you can continue purposeful work. Because those journalists, first responders, firefighters, doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, it is purpose work. It is a high risk job, but they have the skills. That's why we go through a process of, learning and developing our skills to be effective in the work that we do, but also skills in terms of self-care and ensuring that we're taking care of ourselves so that we have the maximum capacity to support those who need our help. So we need to ensure that we take care of ourselves, because if we're injured as well and we go out and we support the injured people, we're causing further harm to ourselves and to our clients. But of course, the risk of being impacted is there. But when you are impacted, what are you doing, for that recovery and to resolve afterwards?
The other thing I saw when I went to charity, there was this woman and a little girl. The girl was about 7 years old, and she was crying, and it was closer. There was a barricade set up to prevent the press from accessing the site where they were identifying the bodies. But the woman was standing there with this child who's crying. So we asked, why is she crying? Did somebody for her die? And she was like, no, we don't know anybody here. The mother was interested in, seeing what's happening. She said the child didn't want to be there, that she doesn't like that these kind of things, right? And we saw her there, and we said, okay. And we went on doing our work. But then we saw her again, and I thought to myself, I was like, why is this child still here? And she was physically there, but there are children on Facebook. And I'll share a personal issue. As a journalist, I try when I'm driving, I'm listening to the news, but I also have my children in the vehicle with me. And my son, he's listening too. And he said, Mommy, did the baby die? I immediately cut off the news because I'm thinking he has several questions. Mommy, how did the baby die? Why did the baby die? He's asking. And when I realized this thing is taking toll, because days later, he came back with the same question. I said, the baby died, yes, but let's move on. You understand? He is 4 years old, and he's trying to understand what happened when the vessel sank. So I realized there and then that I ought not to listen to these newscasts when he's around, because he's smart and he's asking questions now. So those are two examples. But what would be your advice to people who are constantly, going through all the materials on social media that are available in news papers, but how do we guard our children against such and the impact?
Yeah, so we have to be responsible for our well-being and the well-being of the most vulnerable around us, specifically children and the elderly. So my grandmother is 96 and she's blind, but we put on the radio for her. Her caregiver puts on the radio every day. And of course it came on the radio and she heard, and when I went to see her, she was there and she was talking and she was like, this tragedy. And then it's like, okay, moving forward, we have to ensure that if for now we have to turn off the radio so that she doesn't get this information. So adults, we need to be more responsible. We need to be aware. And sometimes they don't know. Some people just don't know better. So now I'm glad that you asked that question. It's just to be a bit more aware of the information that children and the elderly are taking in right now, especially as it relates to this tragedy. And if by chance they still get the information, it's to prepare yourself to answer their questions and create a space for grounding and processing. So try your best to prevent the circumstance of them hearing and engaging with the material. And if, by chance they do, prepare yourself. So there's child-friendly language that you can use with children. And also to know that children may not necessarily have that level of the cognitive ability to fully understand what is happening, but it's to let them know that, even in death and dying and talking to younger children, some of them are at a stage where they don't understand that what death is, like the person is never coming back. Some of them, they still expect the person to come back because that's the state of where their brain at in terms of development. So it's just to answer questions where you can, and where you can't, be honest and say, Mommy, Daddy, or Uncle, I don't have an answer for that. But provide comfort as well, because of course they will have emotional reactions. So you may not have the words, but you can provide the necessary tools for them. So even if just giving them a hug, and also modeling healthy coping mechanisms, ensuring that they're drinking their water, ensuring that if they want to cry, allow them to cry. Crying is good. Talking is good. If you don't want to talk, it's fine. Do you need a hug? Do you need to go and play? Do you need to go and walk outside barefoot? Do you need to exercise? And with the elderly especially, of course, pay attention to the elderly. They're also vulnerable and they will have heightened emotional reactions. And it's to ensure that they get the necessary support and comfort as well.
The other issue is, and I'm going to take this from government's perspective, because they've said, which I do not necessarily agree with, they would have, in a sense, well, they haven't said this, but they have blocked the media off from accessing certain areas. For example, the site where they're identifying the bodies. Now, I said to somebody recently that we're professional journalists. This is something that we've trained years. We have veteran journalists here in Guyana. I've been in the profession for more than 17 years. And we understand the ethics of journalism and we practice those. Now, we would not go and video a body that is highly exposed and decomposed and certain things like that. We won't show the images of children in rape cases and things like that. But not everybody on social media or everybody with a camera and a mic, not everybody's a reporter or a journalist or a professionally trained photographer that is doing journalism. So there's a difference, right? But what advice would you offer based on what you've seen? Because in the media also, we must admit that there is a high turnover. At the Guyana Press Association, we constantly try to train journalists and teach them the right from wrong. But there's a high turnover, that's one. But also we're also competing with people, social media influencers, citizens who just decided, you know what, I'm here at the accident or I'm here at the incident site. There's a body. Let's just show it up on Facebook. And so it's exposed to everybody else. What recommendations you would offer to journalists based on what you've seen in the local press, those practicing journalism, and what advice you'll offer to social media people, the influencers who also attempt to practice some media related, I'm not going to say journalism because we're very protective of our work, right? But also tend to share and disseminate information, and the importance of not disseminating false information, because also that has an impact on grief and trauma and how people process.
Yeah, so not excuse the government's response, but based on all of those factors that are working together, you can see why they went to extreme response to block everyone. And the journalists, unfortunately, are impacted. So social media has, over the years, before, certain things could not have been put on social media. Yeah. They were very strict regulations. Yeah. But unfortunately, the space has become very unsafe where you're scrolling and you're seeing the most gruesome images. So I think we need to, from the top, lobby with social media platforms to ensure that they maintain those strict guidelines and block distressing images, ensure that is always enforced. And then for individual responsibility, we all need to be ethical. People need to know what they can and they cannot do. So in terms of influencers and I guess the new up and coming, I don't know, we don't call them journalists. I don't know what's the name for them, but it's for them to know, and of course to be trauma informed. I think once we have a trauma informed society and a grief literate society, we will see the reduction of these things happening. They just don't know. Some people are ignorant. They just don't know. So I would advocate, and for years I've been advocating and sharing information and ensuring people are trauma informed, and to let them know that if you do this, it increases the risk of this. So with information is power. So for those who are not professionals, who are not trained, once they understand that they cannot do this, of course you can't force them. It's for them to now sit within themselves and say, okay, I choose to not do this. For the journalists, of course, I stand with you, and I hope that there is stricter enforcement and regulation so that there is a process where the professionals can access things, so that we don't have to go to extreme cases where everybody is now barred. So there must be a space for the stories to be told, for the journalists to be on the ground. All of that is a part of informing the public.
And providing clarity as well.
Yes, and providing clarity. So even when we see misinformation, report it. Or if we got comment and say this is not true, so that the others who are not informed, when they come and they go to the comments, they can see somebody saying this has not been verified and this is not true. And that's what happens with me sometimes. If I see certain things, I go to the comments, and many times from there I get the information that I need, whether it's true or not. And of course I go to the trusted news sources for confirmation as well. So we need to be responsible. We don't need to take in everything that we see. We need to ensure that we do additional research to ensure that this information is true. And for those who are contributing to the chaos and the misinformation. Is for us to encourage them, reprimand them in whatever way, and let them know that this is unprofessional, this is not necessary, this is unneeded. You can share stories, you can still be an influencer, but you have to be ethical about it. You have to be empathetic about it. Think about the families. So education for sure, more programs where people become trauma informed and grief literate, and also letting people know what is right and what is wrong. And yes, we can do it with adults, and we can even start it from in the schools and the young children, so that they grow up knowing that this is right and this is wrong. Because yes.
No, we would have spoken about a lot, but you're the specialist and you would know that because I don't want you leaving saying, you know what, there's this particular aspect of grief and trauma that we did not address. So as we close, your closing remarks, and if there was anything that we may have forgotten or I would have forgotten. Yeah.
Every time I speak and I advocate, and even with my students at UG, I tell them healing and recovery is possible. As it relates to grief, we grieve forever. There is no timeline. Don't judge. In the Caribbean, we tend to put a timeline based on our culture. After a certain amount of time, we can't talk about the deceased, we can't look at pictures, we can't do nothing. So I'm pleading with people to just ensure that you continue to hold space and create an environment where, if it's after the funeral, those who are directly impacted and affected, they can express how they're feeling, and that helps them in the healing process. As it relates to trauma, trauma is an injury. Trauma is something that disrupts our worldview. Trauma is something that makes us feel that we are under some form of threat. So recovery is possible. I don't want you to think that, because this traumatic event has happened to me or to somebody that I care for, it means that their entire life is over and they can't function ever again. Of course, the risk of impaired functioning has increased, but you can play a role, and there are resources out there to aid in the recovery, and to get them to that place where the intensity and the duration of those normal trauma reactions are lessened over time, and they can come to a place where they can make sense of what happened. That's where the processing begins as well. So healing and recovery is possible. And to the entire nation, specifically to the families, my sincerest condolences. And for those who are holding space for the families and the communities, continue to do so. But most importantly, take care of yourself, take care of your bodies, take care of your minds. Do what you need to optimize brain health. Do what you need to do to take care of your heart health and your body, so that you can be in a place where your capacity to respond and provide us the necessary support is expanded. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Well said. Thank you so much. And as we close tonight's program, we remember the lives that were tragically lost in the MV Barima disaster. Each person was more than just a name or a statistic. There were sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, friends, neighbors, colleagues, whose lives mattered deeply and whose absence will be felt for years to come. To every family mourning the loss of a loved one, to those still living with uncertainty, and to the survivors carrying both visible and invisible scars, we extend our deepest condolences and unwavering support. We also pay tribute to each and every search and rescue operators, the healthcare workers, the volunteers, the fishermen. They're out there doing tremendous work, and we want to say thank you. The search and rescue operation continues, and we just want to wish those persons who are out there in the sea at charity, just waiting, praying and hoping. We wish them all the best, and we will continue to pray as a people. On behalf of New Source, I would also like to wish them our sincerest condolences and support. Thank you. Stay well.